Buongiorno, Bracy here. So today I want to talk about avatars, and more specifically I want to talk about, well, eventually we're going to talk about white hands. So, avatars, if you don't know, avatars are basically what we embody when we are playing in virtual reality, or something that represents our body, our self, the visual representation of who we are or what we are, depending on what it is that you are controlling. If you've seen the movie Avatar, not the one that derived from The Last Airbender, but the Avatar, the one by James Cameron, you probably familiar with this idea that somebody is controlling essentially a body. And Lumo essentially has an avatar mode where you can control, like a remote control robot essentially, and you can see through its eyes and you can tell it where to go and what to do. So it's not too dissimilar when we're talking about an avatar when you're in a virtual environment. You obviously you'll be able to see through, but then you hear whatever that avatar would be able to hear, and your hands control whatever the hands do. You move whatever, and everyone's trying to find like what is the best way to represent somebody in a virtual space. And ultimately I think it really comes down to the experience. Like the avatar should change with whatever experience that you're experiencing. I know that Facebook, Oculus, has worked really hard to make a universal avatar, something that represents you when you're going in between experiences, but like you can always use what you want to look like. But I find that this becomes difficult when you're playing a character in a different experience and you look in the mirror. You should be whatever that character is. And the character and who you are should inform how you look should inform kind of like what you've gone through, who you are, what your feelings are within the context of that experience. And I didn't really appreciate playing video games growing up, how often I had to play. I didn't appreciate, and appreciate's not the right word, but I didn't really quite notice how often I had to play a white character until more than recently, as soon as I jumped into virtual reality. And almost always your avatar was white, and especially in the beginning. And the worst thing is like when they force you to have a white character's hands. And the issue with this isn't that it's a white character, is that ultimately there isn't necessarily a need within the story for that character to be white. So then it's just pointlessly, it's just forcing me to be a specific character. I can't remember the name of this experience, but there was one that I had run into in VRLA. And it was a booth not too far down from my own, and they had this amazingly interesting kind of steampunk world. It was kind of a fantasy. You're a character that builds a robot and all this stuff. And ultimately, they decided that because the character that you play, the person that you play, there is a voice. There is a voice that is speaking, and ultimately you need to embody this character and it's going to speak for you. So the character that they made was this white character. But ultimately, if you don't see what color your hand is, like especially since this character was an engineer, this character could have very easily worn gloves, and you could have they could have gone for a hand that's kind of like neutral in size and shape. It doesn't have to be, especially if it's gloved, it'll be kind of harder to tell. As long as it's not like on the gigantic manly grip side, like my hands tend to be on the larger side. But my mom's got huge hands too. But I think the idea is that creators that force you to embody something that doesn't actually have any added value. In fact, for anyone who isn't a white guy or a white woman, depending on the shape of the hands, it really just kind of, it's another layer down out of the immersive step. So like it just kind of steps you out. It doesn't let you like kind of lose yourself within the character and as much as it would if it wasn't something that like your brain didn't see and be like, well, those are obviously not my hands. I think gloves are the way to go, because really, why, like, why are you gonna lock somebody into a skin color? It's a virtual environment. It's a virtual world, unless you're doing something like I Am Man, something that is about embodying somebody who isn't getting enough representation, and people on the outside of their experience can't understand what it is to be like them. Then okay, like you need to understand what it is to be a black man, a black woman, an Indian person, somebody who's Asian. So like just different. If the context is to to give somebody exposure to something that they've never had exposure to, I don't think that's a bad thing. But as long as it's a conscious choice, I think the issue is that like it's so unconscious, and it's unconscious to the point that people just feel like they just because they've been doing this for so long with video games as like, well, it's just the default. But like a white guy is not a default. That mindset is a representation of the culture that's been making video games for the longest, but that's not a representation of all the fans of video games. That's not a representation of all the people who want to make video games or want to make interactive things. It's just a representation of the people who could. And that's what sucks, because that shouldn't bleed all the way into I'm going into this world to escape, and I have to exist and empathize with a character that is ultimately doesn't represent me in any way, shape, or form, even virtually. Like I don't know. So I'm interested in what other people think about this, just because like I think you'll find that split is most people who never consciously thought about it, they'll go like, oh, I get it. And I think the people who are guilty of doing it ultimately, because they wouldn't necessarily want to feel bad that the choice that they made was like harming people, I think they're gonna ultimately they're going to be more likely to have find fault in the issue. But this isn't attacking the people who have unconsciously, or even to some extent consciously, chosen to do this. It's just to open up the conversation to say there is a better way. And ultimately, it will only help the people who are unconsciously doing it to engage with people in a way that they don't, like one simple tweak of something can make a world of difference. Like one simple tweak of putting gloves on somebody and giving them reason to have the gloved hands, or even just changing the type of character that it is entirely. Like it doesn't have to be a human. Like it can be humanoid, it can be alien, it can be a creature, it can be a monster, it can be something different. It's virtual, you know? I don't know. I don't know why this was just sitting in the back of my head and I wanted to express it, but I thought that was interesting. I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the field below. And arrivederci.